So I would love to know what you're curious about, and it could be anything even beyond just the topic of today, which is going to be writing the so-called perfect villain. It's a little bit of a catchy title to get people's attention. I don't know if there's such a thing as a perfect one, but I'll get into all of that. We have some more hellos here, and I love how international we are. We have Victoria, British Columbia, Mumbai, Durham, England, another from Victoria, British Columbia. Hey, you might be neighbors. Hello from Florida and Connecticut, Istanbul, North Carolina. This is very truly the International Screenwriters Association. I love seeing that. Purple Mags, is there a haunting in Connecticut? It's the time of year, and I'm referencing the Virginia Madsen movie Haunting in Connecticut. Or is it of Connecticut? No, in Connecticut. That would be weird if the entire state was haunted. Hello from Ohio. I don't know why there's a question mark. Deanne, are you sure? Are you not sure that you're from Ohio? I'm just kidding. North Carolina, it's good to see everybody. We've got an interesting topic to talk about today, and I probably will just jump right in. But if for those of you who don't know, I have a long background in working with and developing writers and their material, 20 plus years of working in the entertainment industry. And Deanne is saying, because I'm not international. Hey, we're all a part of the human race. That's really all that matters. But long history of working in the industry, working with writers, primarily within the screenwriting and the writing space. I've been doing this kind of thing in terms of hosting webinars and live events and panels, and of course, creating coursework and teaching, educating writers for a long time. And so this is very normal to me. And so if I speak too quickly, or if I say something that you want me to repeat, please feel free to post a comment. Say, hey, wait a minute, can you say that again? Or can you explain this? I may not be paying attention to the comments as I'm going through the lecture, because I just want to make sure I'm clear. And I have a whole bunch of notes and things that I'm going to be going through. But the specific questions, feel free to ask them. Scott will be tracking those, and he'll save them, and we'll get to them at the end. So even though you may be commenting and asking questions or something, don't think I'm just ignoring you. I kind of get into a mode. And so if I go too quickly, you can pause, and I'll check every now and then in terms of looking at the comments. But it's an interesting topic, because we all think we know so much about, the antagonist. I never use that word, or the word protagonist, because it's just a little too vague for me. I like choosing words when we're developing material that actually help me develop the material. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but the word antagonist is just too broad. I mean, every character in a story is in some way going to antagonize the main character. Maybe it varies in a level of degree, but there's an antagonistic nature to any story, because conflict is inherent in every story. And so we chose this topic mainly because, and I'll get back into the protagonist, main character, and the definitions here in a second, but my brain just went to choosing this topic mainly because of the spooky season. Whether you follow or celebrate Halloween, or just enjoy it, or like scary movies, the main focus here is to help you understand this other incredibly important character in virtually every single story ever told. So much emphasis is placed on our main character, making this main character driven, and making sure our main character changes, and the flaws that main character has. We all need to do that. Like, that's just as important, but our other characters are equally essential. And so I wanted to have a separate lecture focusing strictly on this antagonist, as some of you call it. I'm not saying you're wrong. You can use that word if you're used to it, but I define them in different ways. So the way I'm titling this is Writing Compelling Villains and Human Opponents. So we'll just kind of start from the top. Like every story that you've ever enjoyed, loved, or virtually even watched, and really probably every book, it's only as good as the person standing in that main character's way. And without a great opponent, in a way, it's like the hero is just kind of experiencing like therapy, and it isn't as engaging. We want this to be active. So when I say villain, we might naturally picture like a cape wearing, like shadow lurking, world ending bad guy. But I kind of want to stretch that definition a little bit. And this is why I don't use the words antagonist or protagonist, because there are varying forms of these characters, and it helps to define them a little bit more. Plus, these terms are pretty universal. Because, for one, a villain is not always evil. And sometimes, more often than not, yes, they're just right, or at least they believe they're right. And that's what makes them so-called dangerous. So we want to be thinking along those lines, villain versus opponent. So those are the two forms of reference. In my coursework, and sometimes when I'm working with my writers one-on-one, I sometimes identify them as a rival as opposed to an opponent or a villain. We start stretching the grounds a little bit, but we'll just look at villain versus opponent. So we'll start with that distinction that I think a lot of writers miss. It's that difference between a villain and an opponent. So I want to start there. For one, and you can write this down if you have anything, to make notes with, because I'm not going to be sharing any like handouts or anything. This is all just purely up to you to remember. That's usually how lectures work. I want you to take some notes. But a villain, it acts with malice. It's driven by domination or destruction. Those are the two primary elements to a true villain. And an example could be like Hans Gruber of Die Hard. Acts with malice, driven by domination and destruction. An opponent, though, they act with conviction, and they're driven by belief, need, or love. Obviously, it could take the form of a negative version of love, but they're not evil. And so there's a difference there, and you want to be able to differentiate, because that term villain is way too broad. If you're actually writing a romantic comedy, for example, you probably aren't going to have a purely evil character in a rom-com. So an example from the movie While You Were Sleeping, which I hope you have seen. It's a wonderful little romantic comedy. It's a perpetuation of a lie story. I watch it every year for Christmas because it has a little Christmas theme going. But Jack's fiance, Bill Pullman's character in While You Were Sleeping, is a great example of just an opponent. And I'll get into the differences here, and as far as looking at a rom-com opponent versus some others. But a villain is intentional. So they create chaos in order to achieve control. An opponent is more organic. They're just in the hero's way because their goals conflict. Now, you could argue that goals can conflict even if you have a villain, but it helps to differentiate the two of these things. So we'll just look at Die Hard a little bit. Hans Gruber, he isn't necessarily evil just for evil's sake. He's brilliant, charming, calculated, and completely justified in his own mind. Really strong belief system. So you could list that as a requirement for a villain and or opponent, but it's more so even for a villain. So he thinks he's smarter than everybody else. His flaw is arrogance, kind of wrapped in a little bit of over sophistication. He's a villain because he's aware of his manipulation. He knows exactly what he's doing. An opponent doesn't always necessarily come from that place of true manipulation. And now if you compare that to While You Were Sleeping, which if you haven't seen it, it's with Sandra Bullock and Bill Pullman and a bunch of other wonderful actors that you've seen before. But basically, Sandra Bullock's character accidentally tells a lie that she is the fiance to this guy that's in a coma. The guy who's in a coma has this big, huge, loving family, and they all believe her. And they're like, why didn't he tell us that he's going to get married? And they pull her into the family. And it's just this perpetuation that she's trying to get out of. And it just gets out of control. Jack is the guy who's in the coma. His brother, Peter. Peter is the one who's in the coma. Jack is the love interest to Sandra Bullock. But like the whole family, they're all opponents because they're opposing what Sandra Bullock's character is attempting to do. They're not villains. They aren't trying to hurt Lucy, Sandra Bullock's character. They're just trying to protect the people that they love. And yet, through all of this, they create that much more tension. So the point of this, and it's kind of the quick overview of my differentiation between villain and opponent. An opponent doesn't need to wear black leather or really carry a weapon or something. They just need to stand in the way of your main character's emotional growth. That's the main point I'm making through this whole lecture here. Let's just check to see any comments here. Let's see here. Just saying, having people say hello. Okay, cool. Not missing anything. Okay, so we'll just kind of talk a little bit of the philosophy of a villain here, everybody. I think it's important to go through this, even though some of it's going to be theory, but it's on point in terms of what we're actually trying to do, which is create moments within our screenplay that not only affect the main character, but create the tension and conflict within the story. So your villain or opponent, they have to believe something. I wonder if I'm not really looking at my screen, if I'm getting like the thumbs up thing. No, it's not. But they have to believe in something. So that belief system, like their philosophy, is what makes them powerful. And by powerful, I don't necessarily mean like world dominating power, but they have a presence in the story. They're not just reacting to the hero's goal, they're proving a world view. And this is an important point. It's not just their world view that they're trying to prove, which it will be, but it's something that you as the writer find in today's social and kind of cultural climate that's a bit of a universal worldview. So you want to be thinking that there's an underlying meaning within your story. The opponent is going to have a very strong representation of that underlying meaning. So if you look at something much more lighthearted, like The Little Mermaid and Ursula from The Little Mermaid. This is an easy one because most of us at least know the story or have seen the movie. Ursula isn't just a sea witch. You know, she's a woman who was cast out, ignored, underestimated. She uses her cunning that she's developed and her power to kind of take back control to prove that she can win in a world that silenced her. And so she has a very clear and empathetic motive. And so her philosophy, you could say, is power is taken, not given. So that's not only evil, that's based on her experience. You know, that's resentment turned into survival. So there's empathy for her, not sympathy. There's a very big difference between empathy and sympathy, but there's an understanding of her. She has turned evil, but she hasn't always been that way. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because it's important to have empathy and understanding for that primary opponent. Sometimes you have a Hans Gruber type where we don't really need to care that much or understand that much about why they are who they are, but I don't think it ever hurts. I think movies nowadays, if you look at Die Hard, this is what, in the 80s, and they weren't really evolving the villain as much at that point, as opposed to now. I don't know if for those of you who have seen the movie Weapons, if you haven't, I highly suggest you watch this. It's on HBO Max. I watched it 2 nights ago. Probably one of the better movies I've seen in a long time, much less an incredible horror movie. But Gladys is the main villain, not just an opponent. You'll see why she's a villain. But it's kind of the same thing as Ursula. She's not necessarily a cartoonish villain, even though she kind of looks like, she looks the part of a cartoon. But she's fueled by, you could argue, like generational trauma. You know, this deep sense of injustice, if you really wanted to dig deep into who that character is. And so her worldview isn't destroy the world. It's make the world see what it's ignored. And really, she isn't necessarily doing that on purpose. She's a very layered character, even though we don't really learn that much about her in the movie. She's just trying to survive. And she's lost all morals revolving around how to survive. So I don't want to give anything away, but she's making choices from a human place. So she isn't just a monster, but those choices are purely selfish, like so selfish that it's killing people. And she doesn't care. And so this makes her a villain. You would not see that type of character in a rom-com. It would be a pretty dark, horrific romantic comedy, So that's what we want to chase when we're developing an opponent: belief-based opposition. This character is going to have a very strong belief. So, to kind of summarize a little bit, a villain doesn't just wake up wanting to be evil. They wake up wanting to be right. And rarely are they considering the other person in that equation. That's the real definition of a true villain. Opponents do somewhat of the same. It's just without that lack of morals, and sometimes depends on the story. Okay, so Think of it this way, in terms of a story in general, it's kind of like flaw versus flaw. If you consider main character versus opponent, try to think of it that way as opposed to just these characters, right? Every hero's or main character's flaw has to meet its match. And that's how you build like this meaningful evolution through conflict within the story. And I talk about this a lot through in my story farm consulting and in the coursework. It's like this flaw and theme opponent sort of triangle. They're all connected. So if your main character's flaw, just as an example, is control, then your opponent has to thrive in chaos. You know, we want to see the opposite. So that's these two flaws going up against each other. And that results in forcing the main character's growth through surrender. So that's what I mean by this kind of triangle of flaw, theme, opponent. We see a message coming out by way of the character changing, but what's changing is the flaw going, and it's going up against the opponent's flaw or belief system. And as another example, if your main character's flaw is avoidance or risk averse, then your opponent has to, and it must, love to force confrontation, because it's the whole point. Every story we're writing has some level of a main character flaw kind of, you know, transporting through the story. The main opponent or villain is going to be opposing that. And so therefore they have to clash. So you can look at opposites in a way when we're looking at flaws. So the result of that, main character seeking validation, your opponent then kind of manipulating praise or kind of weaponizing approval. The result becomes it forces the main character to find independence. Now we have a reference to theme. Flaw correction is naturally connected to theme. So we can put this in context just a little bit. Like if you look at Die Hard, most of us know the movie Die Hard, so it's an easy one to reference. John McClane is, you know, he's struggling to hold on to control, and his marriage, his kids, just his job, his life in general. Here comes Hans Gruber, a man who he controls every room he walks into. It's almost obvious when you really break it down. Gruber is very calm. He's collected. He has that level of control about him, and it makes McClane's chaos of uncontrollability in his life literally explode. And so their conflict, it's not just in the gunfights and the walking on glass, which is they're amazing set pieces, but it's kind of identity versus ego. You know, if you really wanted to get overly theoretical about Die Hard, but it helps to use it as an example, like in Little Mermaid. I love the example of Little Mermaid because, you know, her flaw, Ariel's flaw is so obvious. Has naivete. It's like a naive idealism. And Ursula's strength and, of course, eventual downfall is sort of this cynical pragmatism, or in other words, extreme selfishness. And that's why their clash feels so mythic and so important. But it's also showing us that, in a way, Ariel is potentially being almost as selfish as Ursula by doing and wanting to do what she is wanting to do. I'm not going to explain the story of Little Mermaid. If you haven't seen it, then please crawl out from under the rock that you have been under. But we're seeing, you know, generally speaking, youth versus experience, innocence versus manipulation. Both sides believe that they're right, and they're going to do whatever they can to not only be right, but to achieve what they're attempting to achieve. Again, it's flaw versus flaw. And in a romantic comedy, which can be a little tricky sometimes, because a lot of you are thinking, can my, you know, romantic comedy opponent also be the secondary character, as I called it? You know, someone that's like Doc Brown to Marty, or Samwise to Frodo, or, you know, yes, they usually switch back and forth because the opponent isn't evil. They aren't wholly selfish. They are selfish in some ways, but we all are. You know, like every character is selfish in some way because we're all coming from this place of belief. But if you look at While You Were Sleeping, Lucy wants love, but she avoids risk and connection. It's pretty clear that we see that early on in the story. Her opponent, so-called, you know, it's the family, Jack, just truth in and of itself, because it's a perpetuation of a lie movie. That all forces her to confront what real connection actually not only feels like, but costs. And that's something that connects directly to a risk-averse flaw. And that's kind of the beautiful thing about romantic comedies. You know, the opponent often becomes the ally once the hero evolves. But the hero, I kind of use that interchangeably. We'll just say main character, but the main character has to grow in order to find that ally. And When Harry Met Sally is the same exact thing. They have completely opposing flaws. Harry in When Harry Met Sally is this kind of pessimistic, always right, somewhat narcissistic, misogynist. Maybe not any of those are to the extreme, but he is that way. He doesn't really believe in true love, in romance. That's how we get to see that type of person he is. Sally is the exact opposite. She's wear her heart on her sleeve. She's very loyal, trusting. She's willing to be honest and share the truth, and she believes in true love and et cetera, et cetera. Those things are constantly clashing. So we have to be able to define these elements within our characters, but long before we're writing pages. But the important part about a romantic comedy is that we see the characters kind of go back and forth. Harry every now and then helps support. Sally helps support Harry's choices and is egging him on to grow and become better. And yet she also sometimes flips to an opponent. So you can have that, but it's very genre based. You probably aren't really going to see that necessarily in a true horror movie unless you're playing with the genre and trying to change it up. I'm not saying writing a romantic comedy horror, which why not? I mean, you could, but there could be manipulation there, and we don't necessarily know who the villain is within this horror movie, et cetera, et cetera. It's difficult to give lectures like as blanket statements because every story is different. But flaw versus flaw is another big note that you should all be writing down. Okay, so there's this exercise I have in my coursework. Some of you have taken it either through the 30-day challenge or the craft course or just working with me one-on-one. I call voice pressure points. And basically what this is moments in your past as a writer that you remember occurred to you, either positive or negative, that completely changed your perspective, and it helped define your worldview. That then helps define your voice and the types of stories you want to write, how you write them, the words you choose, because of our past experiences. Every villain or opponent has a voice pressure point too, like this formative moment in their past that defines their worldview now. So, you as the writer and developer of this character, what happened to them, this opponent, that made them believe what they believe. Now, it's not just backstory about trauma or pain or abuse, but what caused them to believe what they believe now. That belief is what drives them, and they're not going to sway from it. The opponent, especially if it's a villain. An opponent might waffle, go back and forth a little bit, but they're still going to be set in those beliefs. If you look at Harry and Sally, my God, Harry was so stubborn. He's basically every man. That's why they call him the everyman. Hans Gruber, his pressure point. I mean, I'm making this up. I don't know if it is, but it could be a lifetime of being the smartest person in the room until someone outsmarted him, and he snapped. Ursula from Little Mermaid being cast out from the kingdom that she once served, and so she now has this level of resentment that's like epic. And Gladys from Weapons, kind of seeing a world that dismissed her, maybe because she's older, but also dismissed her pain, kind of deciding to make them, the world, feel all of this, but by owning them, controlling them, all for the purpose of living forever. So we can define these pressure points, these kind of formative moments in your opponent or villain's past, not just for the purpose of giving it a backstory, but to figure out why are they who they are now and what are their beliefs. And so if you can define that one moment, heartbreak, whatever, humiliation, just and deciding them to make them feel it and for us to see that they feel it, but by owning them and controlling them, we are the creator of this character. We have to be connecting with them just as much. So I'm trying to go off script. I don't want to just read my lecture here, but you're going to find what's going on inside of that character. You're going to find the humanity within the opponent, even a true villain. And then, once you find that humanity, they kind of stop being the typical bad guy, and they actually start being like this other half of your main character. And that's really the whole point of this lecture here. We want to understand, or at least show the audience and let them understand, that the main character is dealing with difficulty in some way, a flaw. They may not even think it's a difficulty, but there's something going on in there. Like Ariel didn't think she was naively idealistic, but she was. She had to go through this experience in order to get through that and over that. And so there's a true representation of something going on in the main character, and that opponent or villain represents that. In some true, slasher type movies, Texas Chainsaw, maybe Halloween, that we're not digging too deep into who these these guys are, but it might be one reason why we don't see too many of those movies anymore, where it's just pure slasher and there's some dude in a hockey mask that can't be killed. He's representing something maybe from the standpoint of our society, or something a little bit broader and maybe not directly related to the main character. But as we see movies like Sinners, Weapons, so many other current like horror movies, thriller movies, there's something much more deeply character connected. Okay, we'll jump to the next little portion here. So there's a term that, we've all heard the word conceit, but we, in the screenwriting world, we use it from the standpoint of it being the most unique element to your story or character. So you have a story conceit or a character conceit. Some movies might have like a cinematic conceit, like The Matrix defined the technology around how they shot it, and it looked different, and they were pausing people in midair. And like, this is a cinematic conceit. It's very unique. We want to be thinking along those lines for our story and our character. Not every single project needs both a story conceit and a character conceit. But ultimately, a conceit is what drives the character. It's their engine. And we see that occur on screen. So you want to dig deep into the most unique elements of this character, draw them out, so that we can then understand who this character is that much more. So your villain or opponent is going to fit the same rule. Their philosophy has to play out in set pieces. So here's another term that some people may be thinking, sure, I know what a set piece is. It's not just a wall or a couch on a set. A set piece is a big moment, like a memorable movie moment. It's I'm trying to think of example. I mean, yippee-yi-yay, motherfucker, sorry for the language, from Die Hard. It's those memorable movie moments, those set pieces. Character is infused in those set pieces. In Whiplash, I'm assuming you've seen the movie Whiplash. Every scene between Andrew and Fletcher, the student and the teacher, it's an example of control versus freedom. A young person represents freedom in a lot of ways. The older person is representing control. In Die Hard, every single action and moment kind of reinforces that intellect versus instinct. And in The Little Mermaid, every song, transformation, it reinforces kind of this seduction of the easy way out, the longing, the dream, kind of the glamorization of that dream. And that's what keeps audiences hooked, because the opposition isn't just an emotional one. Like we see it, it's visible, it's cinematic. So we don't just hear it in the dialogue. So it's a separate little section that is reminding us that, there's a unique element to the conflict between the main character's flaw and the opponent's flaw. You have to brainstorm moments and scenes that are going to show that. And so we can very often use our villain or opponent as a way to help us develop the story. What are the scenes and moments that we will be watching on screen that help show and defy this representation between the differences here, but also the connection between the main character and the villain? Okay, so choice and transformation. The thing about really great villains, and before I dive in, let me see. Is there anything I'm missing here? Judy, can you please say again what an opponent is versus a villain? Okay, so we'll pause in section 6 here. So yes, think evil versus just strong belief, but we'll repeat this. So a villain acts in malice or with malice and is driven by domination or destruction. That's really at the heart of a villain. An opponent doesn't necessarily have those elements. Instead, and yet still, they're acting with conviction, and they're driven by belief, need, or even love. Usually it's from a selfish place. So really the biggest difference is that an opponent won't necessarily have this acting with malice or, driven by domination or destruction. Rarely, if ever, are you going to find an opponent that is evil. A villain, it's Satan. There's an evil quality to them because they've become so entrenched in their beliefs that they've gone too far, and they've become a monster in some way. Opponents can still be monstrous, but they're not. There's a lack of evil there, Interesting question from Muggs, and it might stump me. I'll get to that at the end, though. Jess is asking, where do narcissists fit in? I'll just say they don't. Where do narcissists fit in? I would think there's a level of evil to them, a little bit more than opponent, because a narcissist will go further in the propping up of their belief through action than maybe an opponent would. And there's a very fine line, because you could still have someone with narcissistic tendencies, but there are varying levels of narcissists. There are serial killers, and yet there are people who just have slight narcissistic, kind of overly selfish tendencies. And so it kind of depends on where you want that character to fall. Jess, it's a good question, though. I don't like the one thing about this lecture, or really any lecture that I ever give, or anytime I'm working with someone one-on-one, through call packages or in any way, rarely is there a blanket statement for, like, especially when I see classes that, like, here's how to write great dialogue. And I always like, let's be careful, because dialogue is such a personal thing, and it's so specific to your story. There are little things you can learn that can help you write better dialogue, but it's so much more of a feeling. Anyway, it's difficult to give blanket statements. Yeah. I'm just seeing other comments. Okay. Okay. So choice and transformation. So the thing about really great villains, if we just want to talk about this, they do so much more than just kind of push your hero to fight. They're and this goes for opponents just as well. So there's really no differentiation here, but they're pushing your hero to choose. We want to remember that. And, what's a story other than just a whole bunch of choices being made over and over again? I mean, that's really all a story is. But that's why in some stories, when you like, especially romantic comedies, there's a fine line between an opponent and a secondary character. A secondary character, again, being the example of that second lead that is going on the adventure with the main character and supporting them. They're not meant to oppose. They can feel opposing, though, because a secondary character will very likely place that main character into situations that the main character won't want to be in. That's technically an oppositional nature. Like, even if you look at Dory from Finding Nemo, this is flaw versus flaw. And even though she's a supporting secondary character, she's not an opponent necessarily. She has an opposing nature to her. Why? Because their flaws are opposite. We have Marlin, who is totally risk averse, overly controlling from the standpoint of being overprotective. And Dory literally, we'll say Marlin can't let go of anything. Dory literally forgets everything every 5 minutes. There is such a level of freedom to Dory that she doesn't know how to worry. So we see it's the opposite of flaw. It's needed in Finding Nemo because there isn't a true villain or true opponent in Finding Nemo. The ocean is kind of the opponent, but every opponent or villain needs to be embodied by a character in some way. Even if you look at Castaway, you can say the island was his opponent. It's man versus nature, blah, blah. It's just way too broad. You have to find specific ways to allow that main character to interact with someone, because every story is a relationship story. Every story, even if you're alone on an island for 2 hours in a movie, which equated to 4 years in real life, but you know what I mean? So it's about forcing the character to choose something. And that's why there can be a fine line between secondary and an opponent or a villain even. And as a reminder, the final battle as I call the battle, or the battle scene, or the battle sequence, the 12th sequence in a full 12 sequence story. That's when we see the main character confront the opponent and or villain. But it isn't just or always physical. It's also moral. It's belief versus belief. The hero or the main character, it doesn't, they don't just defeat the villain. They actually transcend the villain. And you don't always need physical confrontation or to kill the villain to do that. Some movies you do in order to make a point. I was going to maybe give away a little bit of Weapons, but I don't want to. I really strongly suggest you watch Weapons. It's gory. If you can't handle visual violence, then don't watch it. Amazing. Really incredible movie. But like John McClane defeats Hans Gruber. But what really happens? You want to look at the deeper meaning behind the defeat. He lets go of his pride. He learns humility. He kind of reclaims connection as opposed to needing control. And that's how he overcomes the villain, in spite of still physically knocking him off of, Nakatomi Tower, and he's falling. And we see that visual of Alan Rickman falling, but it's the representation of the villain and who he is that shows us that John has overcome his flaws. We have to look deeper. What's going on inside of our main character, what's going on in terms of representation as far as what that villain represents. It's the overcoming of the representation that's more important. Ariel defeats Ursula. What's the big victory, though? Ariel learns that love isn't worth the loss of self or identity. So she had to go through all of this in order to figure out who she is within the situation she is, and to stop longing so badly to be someone that she isn't. What did Ursula represent? All of those things. Like Ursula was trying to steal her voice. She was trying to steal her identity. It's what Ariel needed to find. Lucy, and While You Were Sleeping, she kind of defeats her lie more than the family, but it's a confrontation. But that's a huge part of her flaw. She was never able to confront people because she had a fear of confrontation. She didn't destroy anybody, but she finally told the truth. And it's not just like the plot truth. It was her own personal truth that she tells at the end of the movie. And it's something that she had always avoided. And that's transformation. We see the transformation. We don't just hear it. We're not just relying on the dialogue to tell us about it. We see it, and that's the story, So the villain's role is to push the hero to evolve and or expose their refusal to, but not their goal. See, like there's a very fine line difference there. We as the writer know and understand that the villain's role is to do that. The villain isn't thinking, I'm going to help this character transform. They are just in their beliefs. This is what I'm doing. This is what I'm wanting. And from a representation standpoint, it's almost always the opposite of what that main character's flaw is, or at least a form of the opposite. It doesn't always have to be the exact 180-degree difference. But nonetheless, whether you have a villain or an opponent, you are going to be having them confront them, because what they're confronting is their flaw, what's going on inside of them. So when you build your next project, when you're developing your next, or if you're looking for, a rewrite, we don't need like this twirling mustache dude with this long brimmed hat as your, as a villain. They don't even need to have like some kind of weapon. We don't need to make them more physically dangerous. They need to stand for something that your hero doesn't yet understand. That's really how to make a perfect so-called villain or opponent. And it's always something within the main character that he or she doesn't understand. Like they don't necessarily have to, like a flaw isn't always so negative. They've been living with this, and they've probably been living just fine with this flaw, their main character, for their whole life, or at least for, many, many years. Now we're tuning in to this movie or TV show to see the character be affected here internally by the events that they're experiencing. And those events are usually, if not always, created by some kind of threat, an opponent and a villain. And you could say there are things like, society and the world, or a political situation, or whatever it might be. They're going to be embodied by characters. They meaning those things of society, culture, political, whatever. They'll be embodied by people, because that's how we as an audience actually connect. We have to, how boring would it be? And Castaway almost was. Seeing some guy on a deserted island for 2 hours. I mean, there was a lot more to that story than just seeing Tom Hanks on the island. It was what he learned about himself, and it was that long monologue that he gives with one shot, talking about how he had control over nothing. Look at Tom Hanks's character in Castaway prior to being lost on the island. He was a FedEx manager that was ruled by time. Everything needed to be shipped out and received at these exact perfect times. Like he needed to have control over everything. What happens? He couldn't even kill himself. He lost control over everything. This shows a level of transformation. And, there's a lot more we could talk about in terms of that story. But is there a direct villain or opponent in that movie? Not really. Wilson is kind of a secondary character, somewhat of an opponent, but he's a volleyball. It's the experience that he's having. He is, in a lot of ways, his own opponent, but it's a kind of an experiential type of opponent, which you don't see very often, and we don't want to use that as a cop-out. Everybody, I have a man versus nature story. You're going to have to dig deeper than that. What are you really trying to say with the story? Because man versus nature doesn't help you develop it. It's just this broad statement. So to kind of go back to what I was saying, they need to stand for something that your main character doesn't understand, meaning the opponent or villain. And it's always something within that main character that he or she doesn't understand, because in the end, like literally the end of the story, it isn't about the victory or who wins. And I say this in my coursework, and I think I've said it in my podcast many times. It's really about who changes and how they change. Even though there won't always be a direct relationship, like a literal relationship, like in a romantic sense or even a friendship sense, with the villain or opponent. You don't have to have that. Some of your stories might, but that villain is going to represent something inside of your main character that the main character hasn't yet changed. And so to kind of repeat myself, by overcoming that villain or opponent, we see the main character change. It's a literal visual thing that we see happen. Even if it's this big speech given on New Year's Eve to Sally, at the New Year's Eve party in When Harry Met Sally, we see him do it, and so that's really the whole point of virtually every story, change and evolution. But in screenplay writing, we see the change and evolution. We can't just hear it. So it isn't just about who wins, it's about who changes and how they change. And your villain or your opponent, that source of tension, they're the one who forces that change, but from a place of flaw versus flaw. So write your villains with empathy, yes, not necessarily sympathy, but having an understanding of why they are who they are, not through backstory flashbacks. We don't need long monologues explaining why they are this way. We just understand them. There may be one little moment where there's our empathy scene. Okay, we get it. But it completely depends on your story. And, you want to have respect for this process and your villains, because they are directly tied to what you're trying to do and say with your main character story. So you want to write your main characters like they're kind of one decision away from becoming the opponent, or becoming the villain. And don't take that too literally, because again, every story is different. But there's a direct emotional tie, even though there may not be a literal story tie between the two people. So we need to be able to define those things and see them, because it's going to help you actually, God forbid, develop moments and scenes and set pieces, and then you start putting it together in a sequential order, and your story starts to take shape. So that's the lecture part. Let's see here. We're seeing comments. He kind of hit this just then. Okay, well, let's look at some of the questions. Okay, so this is the one that Muggs is kind of challenging me, because it's a really good question. Is the Michael Douglas character in Falling Down both the main character and the villain? So, yeah, I mean, we're getting into a lot of theory with my potential answer here. I would, from a traditional story standpoint, no. Because traditional story standpoint, you kind of have the triangle of characters: main character, secondary character, opponent, or villain. Like we have these separate characters. You can get more nuanced. In this case with Michael Douglas, yes, you can say he is his own villain, because he is so entrenched in his own belief and he snaps. But from an audience experience, what they do so well in that movie is that we not only have empathy for him, we also have sympathy for him. And it's rare going to have true sympathy for an opponent or villain, like a true opponent or villain. In a romantic comedy, when they bounce back and forth between secondary and opponent, then there's a way to have, you know, sympathy. So again, like I said, this is getting into theory. Society is the opponent and villain, and it's represented by various characters that he wants to kill. You know, the lesson or the moral of that movie, though, is let's not overreact. You know, I mean, I'm putting it lightly. So it's a good question, because there are always examples where you're like, well, what about this? You know, you want to find what works for you, but it all does come down to this idea of what's the battle? What's the inner battle? Flaw versus flaw, you know? I don't know if that helped, Muggs, but it's a good question. Okay, what if the villain is unconscious of the evil their actions create, i.e. they believe it's good? It's the result of their beliefs that show us if they're good or bad. You know, it's an emphasis on show, because most villains are unconscious of it, like, because they're not thinking that what they're doing, I mean, they may know it's going to hurt people, but it's going to help them. And so there's a level of pure selfishness because they're trying to, you know, achieve that goal. I'm trying to think of, and I don't want to give away too many movies, but yeah, I don't want to give away Weapons. You should see Weapons, but it's a good question, because there's still going to be a villain, because we see how it impacts that main character. We see how it impacts the world. We see how it impacts other people. And from a universal standpoint, in a negative way, even though they are like completely unaware of it, they're still going to go forward, and they will likely have some shift or change within the story where we see them become aware of it, and then their decision around it is then going to further define how they move forward. You know, it's kind of the falling down example, because Michael Douglas is not conscious of the evil of his actions. He's walking around with a shotgun, killing people. You know, I mean, this is pretty evil, but it's still creating outward so-called evil. So you guys are testing me. This is a good one. It's a really good question. I still would, you know, what if the villain is unconscious of the evil their actions create or believe that it's good? It's still how you are defining that character in relationship to the main character. Really, that's the important part of it, because the main character is going to have a goal, or a couple characters, whatever you have. So that the story is really revolving around the main character, and then it's the effect on that main character from this villain, who may very well not know that they are creating the evil. And so maybe it's not a villain in that case, it's an opponent. There's still an opposing nature, you know. Who would you say was the villain in Breaking Bad? There are a lot of you know, villains. It's the oh gosh, what was his name? Fred, like Gringe or something. What was his name? Some of you may remember his name. Yeah, I can't remember. Incredible actor. I think he's of like Cuban descent or Puerto Rican descent, the actor, but he was running the fried chicken thing. Like this is kind of the, you know, upper echelon evil. Because if you look at him, I should say villain, because he knows what he's doing. And he knows that, you know, but he's acting in a manipulating way. Now, it's very easy to say that, my brain is completely just going out right now. Our main character, somebody tell me Walt. Yes, Gus is who I'm talking about. But what Walt is our main character. Yeah, the chicken guy. Gus Fringe. Yeah, that's what his name is. Giancarlo Esposito. Thank you, everybody. Walter White. Yeah, so Walt is our main character. The whole idea is to see him break bad, to turn into an opponent, to turn into a villain. And so that's the genius of Breaking Bad. We would argue, really, he is like he becomes a villain, but from a story standpoint, he is not the opponent. His family acts as opponents eventually. Gus Fringe, obviously, you know, villain. because they're then getting in the way of what Walt wants, which is to build this empire. Ultimately, deep down, what Walt wants is to provide for his family, but he starts to use that as an excuse to just feel more powerful. So he turns into his own villain, yes, but we're still rooting for him. So we want to be thinking along the lines of traditional storytelling. You can get into the nuances of things, and you can be very creative in terms of how you are presenting all of these elements. But it's still always flaw versus flaw. We're seeing at first Walt's flaw being very much in a victim mindset. He was treated badly in a previous, job situation, and he holds so much anger over that, and he then felt that he lost power. Then suddenly he's diagnosed with cancer, which means he loses even more power. So this is all about him feeling powerless. So we then see him fall into the negative side of his flaw. We don't always see that in stories. A character doesn't always fall completely into the purely negative side of their flaw, like really bad, like evil version of the flaw, because for every flaw, there's like an evil version of it. But we do tend to see in the latter half of the second act of a movie anyway, or maybe like the latter half, couple episodes of a season in TV, a character lean into their flaw that much more and create problems because of it. It doesn't necessarily mean they're turning evil. Anyway, that's the much longer conversation, but it's a good question. Who would you say is the villain in Breaking Bad? There are a lot of different opponents and villains. I wouldn't say it's Walt from a story structure standpoint. What's your ghost story? It seems like a lot of ghost story movies, the opponent is simply, why is the haunting happening? And disaster movies have a force of nature as the danger. Are these non-character opponents? So yeah, they are non-character oppositional elements, but they're embodied by the ghost. In other words, the house is haunted. I'm thinking of like the old George C. Scott movie, The Changeling. And George C. Scott comes from this very, newly flawed place because he lost his family. He's very sad and depressed. He's very lonely. And so his goal is to figure out why is the house making these noises, and then to find out who's haunting the house. There's not a lot in terms of, representational theory there. It's just a cool story about finding out who's haunting the house. And you can have those stories, everybody. A lot of what I'm talking about in the lecture is, it sounds like we need to go really deep and we need to write some incredibly meaningful, Oscar-worthy, thematic screenplay. And we should, sometimes try to do that. But sometimes you have movies that are just fun ghost stories that are spooky and meant to be scary. But there's usually some kind of moral. There's usually some kind of understanding that if the character can overcome this and solve this, then they will probably overcome something within them. And so, yes, you could say the house is a character, but it's the boy that is haunting the house. It's the father that ended up killing him. Sorry if you haven't seen that movie, because I'm kind of giving that away. And so they're still embodied by characters, even though they're ghosts. All of this is not interchangeable, but malleable, everybody. We just want to understand the basics and the foundations of it all, so that then we can kind of further evolve it and make it our own and get creative with it and see what new approach we can take, because every story has ever been told. So we have to come up with a new version of some of these stories that we've loved, Let's see. How would one craft a story where the main character is the villain of the story, but they don't know it? Sorry, it's not a terrible question. It's a tough one, because a lot of the plot would have to be considered. And that's not me trying to get around the answer to the question. But main character is the villain of the story, but they don't know it. I mean, there will still be opposing characters within the main character's story, even though they may not realize they're the villain. It'll switch eventually, and there will be a reveal, and suddenly that character is villainous, but they won't necessarily be the villain. So there's a difference between kind of the traditional structure of just who the characters are, main character, secondary character, villain, or opponent, and like theoretical stuff and the deeper, more creative ways to look at how we're addressing the story and the meaning behind it, but it's still always going to have meaning. So how would I craft it? I mean, it would need a reveal of some kind, so that whether it's the very end, I don't know, we would probably come out a little bit earlier, because we would want to see the reaction to the character that we as the audience have been pulling for this whole time, or at least have been led to believe that we're supposed to be pulling for this person as a main character. Reacts to and responds to finally seeing, oh, I'm the bad guy. That then will define really the meaning of the story. Like, why are you telling the story this way? And then I'm not challenging you. I'm like, that's a question. What does it mean? And so you want to be thinking, where in the structural, sequential order of things do we find out that the main character finds out that they're the villain? That I think will help define, the meaning of all of this. Let's see. Last question here. Where there are multiple antagonists, is it most effective to relegate some to opponents and have only one clear villain, or does it depend? I mean, the way for me to dodge the question is, it depends. I think it always depends, but is it most effective to relegate some? I mean, there's a lot that goes into making the decision. For one, what is your main character's flaw? We always want to go back to that. What is it within the main character that needs to change and evolve? I'm not saying the main character has to be 180 degrees different by the end, but we do want to see some level of change. Or we're writing a tragedy and the character doesn't change, they're worse. There's a point, like there's a reason for writing that story. I'm not saying that's wrong or bad. You can write a tragedy. May not be very well received because people, tragedies are tough sells. But it also means there needs to be that much stronger of a theme to, like Requiem for a Dream is an example of something that very message based. It's a tragedy. But so you're going back to main character. What is it that this main character has to evolve and change? Then you start defining elements of that character within these various opponents. If one is villainous and evil, great. Why do you want to make that character that way? Maybe there's a piece of your main character that could be that villainous, or there's just because of the type of flaw you're choosing, the opposite of it is evil, or it could very well be very, very negative. So that's why I can't really give a blanket statement to that. Yes, you can totally say, okay, well, these two are going to be opponents, but this one's going to be the primary villain or something. Again, it's why, the word antagonist is a little too broad for me, because everybody is antagonizing the main character, even the ones who are trying to support them. Look at 40-Year-Old Virgin. All those characters, they weren't evil. They weren't really, almost in a way, an opponent. They're just kind of let's see what happens when we put this guy on a bunch of dates, So in a story with a lot of characters, you want to figure out who's my primary opponent or villain, but it's directly related to what's going on inside my main character from a flaw basis. What does that character have to change? That will then help you define who your opponents or your primary villain might be. I don't know if that helped. Sorry. I hope it did. But let me just see some of these other comments here. Yeah, Joel is saying it seems like mystery and revenge are always some key ingredients. I think it's important to have one main story objective, and that might stand behind one villain or multiple. Yeah, for sure. From the basis of where most of us are in our career, we're emerging. We haven't had 3 or 4 movies made. We aren't being paid at a WGA level, or we're not. Some of us watching might be in the union or something, but we're still trying to get noticed. So I think looking first at what's a really great idea, like what's a clean, easy hook. Then let's put some nuanced, layered characters in here, and then we can get into some of the theory. But if you look at Weapons, the basic premise is that at 2:17 a.m. one morning, 17 kids who were all part of this particular classroom in middle school all just got up in the middle of the night, walked out the front door, and disappeared. Like, that's the basic premise. What happened? And so most of the show, or most of the movie, is trying to figure that out, like what's going on. That's intriguing. That's a cool hook. Then what the writers did, it really was one person. It was a writer director. This guy's really smart, and I hope he makes more movies. Was now layered, coming at it from a place of meaning. What am I trying to say? What am I trying to teach or educate the audience? Or at least just make them aware of. I'm trying to make a statement, every movie can make some form of a statement. Even if it's a silly little rom-com, you're talking about love in some way. Here's my version. Here's the statement I want to make about love. We want to start there to make it simplify it so that it's easy for the industry to understand what you're doing with the story. Then you can start going in and start layering these things. And then the industry will be like, oh, whoa, this is a lot more than I expected. That's cool. So anyway, having a layered villain is as important as a layered protagonist or main character, for sure. I think it's a good way to kind of cap this little lecture, everybody. We want to be developing our other characters just as much as we've been taught to develop our main characters. But all of those characters are connected to that main character because it's the main character's story, Yeah, and audiences today really love layered villains. So it's harder to get away with just having a bad guy. Yeah, we need to understand why this bad guy is a bad guy, but also understand how that character is connected to the main character. Weapons is interesting because you kind of have like 2 or 3 main characters because they're telling these separate stories through certain perspectives of this kind of wild hook that they're presenting. But there's a lot more. There's a higher level theme to the movie, wow. Well, so Donald, I don't want to get into a breakdown of weapons because some people haven't seen it. He's asking, what was the point of kidnapping the kids if the villain doesn't weaponize them? I think there are other levels of meaning that they're trying to say about society in that movie. I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to convince everybody, but that weapons is good and you're wrong if you didn't like it like that. I'm not saying that at all. But I don't want to get into that down. It's a good question because it's one of those movies that if I start talking about it, then it kind of ruins the experience for some people. So I don't love doing that, but it's good to think about it and try to break it down. I'm still dealing with watching Sinners last night because I didn't get it as closely as some people did. Beautiful movie. The performances were incredible, and it looked visually amazing. It was pretty long. Anyway, this is not a movie review lecture, but thanks for sticking around, everybody, and for watching and participating. I do maybe like 6 or 7 of these a year for the ISA, and I'm going to continue doing that next year. If you want to work with me, max@thestoryfarm.org. I have a whole bunch of programs starting as early as January. I have a professional screenwriting lab, 3-month course plus workshop, and you get 4 separate reads of your project over the course of longer than just 3 months. You can go to thestoryfarm.org and find out about that if you want. But that's the first thing I'm promoting right now. I won't get into all the other stuff because I'm not trying to make this into a sales pitch. But Darshana says thank you, but thank you to all of you for hanging in there and asking really good questions and thinking about this because it's an important topic from a storytelling standpoint, but also a way to notice our own villains and opponents in our life. What's going on with us? Let's take responsibility of what we're feeling and believing. Maybe we're reacting a certain way to other people because there's a part of them that we're afraid to confront. I don't know why I went there. This is not meant to be a therapy session, but all right, everybody, enjoy the rest of your week, the rest of your weekend. Have fun. If you go out and do something on Halloween, be wary of, the animals because sometimes loud noises can scare them. So please don't fire off any fireworks. I've never understood why people send fireworks on Halloween, but my small town does sometimes. All right, everybody, have a good one, and I'll see you soon.